cloud shining, turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home.
In September 2014, Eckington Town Team received funding from the National Lottery World War I Memorial Committee to commemorate the centenary of the war and bring to life aspects of the harsh realities of this conflict for both soldiers and the people left at home.
Yeah, basically, when Franz Ferdinand visited Sarajevo, much against sound advice, he was assassinated there by allegedly a Serbian, as a result of which Austro-Hungary, backed by Germany, threatened Serbia with war. Serbia relied on its ally Russia. Russia was in an agreement with France and England to defend each other in such an event. But Germany decided that it would attack France first. Now the Franco-German border was very heavily fortified, and Germany decided that the easiest way to get to France, to attack France, was through Belgium. Now England had an alliance, a treaty with Belgium to protect their neutrality. So the moment that Germany went into Belgium, we got drawn into the war.
Oh, hey up, you're here, are you? So, they're wanting to know how me, lad from here, has ended up in this trench, 1917. Well, I'll tell thee. It all started 1914. Seems like an age ago now, but when I think about it, it were only, what, 3 years? Well, I weren't in khaki then, were I? I were at work, in foundry. There were me and my mate Jimmy Tate, young lad. Anyways, he came up to me one day. Here, let me just put that down a minute. He came up to me, didn't he? And he got paper. It was Mirror, I think. And it was saying in Mirror what had happened. Germany had invaded Belgium. Well, that didn't mean out to me like. I'll tell you the truth, I didn't even know where Belgium were. Anyways, we kept getting paper, and do they knows what they were doing in Belgium? I'll tell thee. Germans were coming in to villages, and they were getting the bayonets, and they were picking up babbies, little babbies, and they were chucking them up and catching them on the bayonets. And do they know what else they were doing? They were roasting them. It were all in paper, it were all true, it were there, black and white. Anyways, that made my blood boil like, because I'd got my little lass, our Gracie. She were about that age then, and I thought to myself, Belgium one minute, knocking on my door next minute. Anyways, young Jim, he wanted to join up and all. He were only young, and he wanted adventure. He wanted to get out at foundry, he wanted to see the world, he wanted to see some action. So we both decided to join up. Well, we went down to recruiting. They were down at our local park, and they were all lined up, all men. Anyway, we took his turn, and we lined up, and we got to the front. Now, me being 39, I thought I was going to get a bit of trouble getting in, but there were no problem. I signed up. Anyway, young Jim came up, and I tell thee, he's never lied in his life. And he told him he was 15. Anyway, bloke put his pen down, and he said, no son, they've got to be 19 to join up. Well, poor lad were almost in tears. So I said, so right Jim, we'll have a walk round park. And we walked round park, and I kept my eye out, didn't I? And I noticed sergeant went off, and his corporal came on. And I said, now then Jim, let's get back in queue. But don't forget, tell them they're 19. Anyways, we got to the front at queue, And he told him this time, 19, sir, signed up. He were 19 there, and we were both in. And we were right excited, because we thought, at last, we're going to get at these Germans, and we're going to sort them out. They're not going to be killing our babbies, and they're not going to be walking up our streets. King and country, we're going to get some action.
With incredible contributions from across our region, the exhibition gave school children and people from across the community an insight into life on the front line, the role of women during the war, and the history leading up to and throughout the conflict. Artifacts, poems, and available podcasts were brought together, and a photo was commissioned in tribute to the local heroes who fought for us.
Well, initially, we sent our expeditionary force, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF as it's often referred to, also referred to, of course, by the Kaiser as that contemptible little army, hence the expression, the old contemptibles. Very proud sort of nickname. They met a lot of very strong opposition, and obviously they needed reinforcements. And Lord Kitchener started his appeal. You've seen the poster where he points his finger out that you're needed. And the response was absolutely overwhelming. And in certain areas, the locals were persuaded to join what were referred to as PALS regiments. It looked like a good idea, but when, having trained in 1915, they went over the top on the Somme in 1916 and were wiped out in their thousands, there were whole neighbourhoods who had nobody returning.
So, here we were, in this new trenches now, on the Somme. And I tell thee, we didn't have these in them days. We'd only just been issued with these, and there weren't even enough of them to go round. As one battalion went into trenches, the battalion coming out handed one. Only them in trenches got one. No, we still had these things in 1916 as PH helmets. Well, we thought these were a great joke. When we had to wear them, we couldn't breathe very well and we couldn't see very well. But luckily, we didn't get in many gas attacks. You see, we were the new army, and we were going to be used for this new major attack. And we were excited, because even though we'd seen a little bit of action in 1915, not much, and we wanted to get at them. Jimmy wanted to really get into these Germans.
As far as the home front, as it's often referred to, is concerned, it was not a war like the Second World War. We, at first, we didn't actually experience the same sort of dangers. But, of course, by December 1914, the Germans were regularly shelling towns on the east coast, Hartlepool, Scarborough, Whitby. That caused fatalities. Because of the drain on manpower, women were encouraged to go to work. They worked in all sorts of fields, whether it was in the fields as the Land Army, in factories, munition factories. They worked on the railways, they worked on the buses, they did almost everything. And of course there was a Women's Army Corps as well in that early conflict. Of course the other effect was that they were seeing soldiers injured coming home. Stately homes were requisitioned for the purpose of hospitals. Young women were recruited into the first aid organisations, the Red Cross, the VAD, the Volunteer Aid Detachment. And of course, ultimately, a lot of families didn't have somebody coming home. They suffered as a result of their menfolk being killed and not repatriated.
Well, we believe that the button on the far side is one that's possibly saved somebody's life because it's got what looks like a bullet scar on it. The other one, rather interestingly, tells another story entirely and was clearly a sweetheart brooch.
Anyway, they told us that our battalion was going to be there on the first day and we were going to have some real action. And then the officer came round and he told us what the plan was. That sees, the Germans, we were going to bombard them. And we weren't just going to bombard them for 1 or 2 days, we were going to bombard them for 5 days. 5 days solid. We thought this was fantastic. Anyway, it started, didn't it? We were in our line and we could hear shells going over, day and night, day and night. But then something terrible happened. On the third day, started raining. Oh, it bloody chucked it down, didn't it? It was absolutely chucking it down. And we were sat in reserve line, water dripping off us, dripping all down as we were wet through. And I turned to the sergeant and I said, "They're not going to make us attack in this, are they, sir?" Well, I can imagine what he said to me. Anyway, luckily, it stopped raining. And then that bee decided they were going to postpone the attack for 2 days, but they weren't going to stop the artillery. Now Jerry was going to get 7 days. 7 days bombardment. We thought it was brilliant.
The trenches were devised, this was a new form of warfare. They were devised really to get soldiers below ground, or at least some sort of cover, because the areas that they were fighting on, the battlegrounds in Flanders, were very flat, very open. There was very little natural cover, and what there was usually destroyed by artillery fire. Life in the trenches was pretty bleak. Men were stood to early in the morning, and then again late at night. Sentries regularly and in fact permanently watched the opposition. Very often the so-called no man's land was very close to each other, the front-line trenches, and we see a reflection of that, of course, at 1914 when the Christmas truce took place and chaps simply went out and played football. Trench foot was a problem because the trenches were full of water. Rats were another problem. Disease. Life really has been described as hell on earth as far as soldiers were concerned. They were only too pleased to be relieved, either by going over the top or being returned for rest and relaxation.
Anyway, we then moved up into the support line and we got our final orders. You see, our battalion is cut up into 4 companies. Each company, A, B, C and D, had got a different job. A company, they were the assault troops. Now their job, they were going to get out of the trenches half an hour before the final whistle, and they were going to crawl out into no man's land. And then when the whistle blew at 7:30, they were going to jump up and charge into Jerry's line. And then B company, that's me, our job was to get out at 7:30, and we were to get across our land, get into Jerry's land as fast as we can. Our job was to take all the equipment. So we've got to take telephone line, barbed wire pickets, extra ammo, extra food, everything we needed to turn that German line into a British line. And then we were to hold it and wait for C Company. C Company were coming out at 8 o'clock, coming over, jumping into this new trench that we now owned, teaming up with A Company and then bombing off onto German second line. D Company, they were being held in reserve. So we knew what the job was, and we were all excited. And then eventually we moved from the support line into the front line. Well, we got into the front line just before A Company had to go out. They had a tot of rum and out they started crawling. We had half an hour to wait. Well, that half an hour seemed like 3 hours, and we were sat in that trench. Anyway, we took the time to get all his equipment on. I helped young Jim get all his equipment ready. He helped me get mine. I had to carry barbed wire and a barbed wire picket. He had telephone wire. Anyways, time ticked by. 7:30 came. Officer told us to get out the trench. So we got out the trench. Now, it was a beautiful day. Absolutely beautiful. Sun was shining, grass were growing. And I looked, and it was slightly uphill all the way, 250 yards. Jerry was just other side of that top of hill. So we set off going. All of us, rifles ready, bayonets on, ready to go. And we set off as fast as we could. Anyways, it weren't long before I started to notice that men round me were having a sit down. Some of them having a lay down. And I thought to myself, well, that's not right. Lads like us come here for a fight, having a sit down. And I turned to young Jim, lad, and I said, here Jim, what's happening? Why is everybody having a sit down? Is it because it's such a nice hot day? Anyways, he turned to me And he said, "Don't be stupid, you silly old bugger."
As far as the Somme is concerned, I think there were lots of overestimations. There was a great reliance on the artillery barrage. Our troops were told that the Germans had been completely wiped out. It was going to be simply a walk across to their lines. In actual fact, the Germans had very, very deep entrenchments, and when the barrage started, they simply retreated underground. And when our chaps started to walk towards them, and they did walk, some even kicked footballs and things like that, the Germans came up back to the front line trenches, opened up with the machine guns and wiped out swathes of British troops. It was actually described as like shearing wheat and cornfields. They were just swept by... and of course the other problem that had been created was that all the barbed wire had been cut at certain points. So our people simply concentrated on passing through those clear points, which made the machine gunner's job even easier. And thousands were killed on the first day, and the battle just continued, and we poured troops and troops and troops in, and it just was an absolute bloodbath.
Well, there's me being told off by a young lad. I nearly gave it back in my hand, but we carried on. We carried on up this hill, and I kept hearing buzzing flying around. Fuff, fuff, fuff. And I kept seeing guys starting to sit down, and then it dawned on me. They were bullets, and these lads were getting hit. And me, I turned to a young lad, and I said, "Jim, what are we going to do?" And he looked at me and he said, "We keep going, Cliff. We keep going." So we kept going up that hill, and I kept going, and I kept looking down, and I noticed our lads were dropping. I noticed our lads were dropping all over. Anyways, I get to the top of the hill, and I look down, and what do I see? Jerry line, barbed wire. Our artillery had never broke it. And what's just in front of barbed wire? A Company. A Company are hung on that barbed wire, or laid in front of it. Well, I stood there, and I thought to myself, this is it, Cliff. They're not going to get any further. And then I saw it. I saw my salvation. There were a dip, probably a shell hole in front of wire, and I said, "Get in there, Cliff." Well, I'd already dumped all my equipment before we'd even got up that hill. And I saw that hole, and I got in it. I laid there, and I chucked everything away. I took my webbing off, chucked my stupid mask, gas hood, chucked my webbing, and I laid there. Now, there's only one thing a soldier turns to when he's in that trench, and he knows his time is up. And I went in my pocket, and I pulled my Bible out, and I started reading. I don't know where I started, and I don't know where I ended. I must have blanked out, because I was so stressed up, and the sun was shining, and I got no water, I got note. Anyway, when I came to, it was starting to go dusk, and I thought, right then, Cliff, get this end back. So I started crawling, didn't I? I started crawling back down that hill. Now, start with, I'm coming across men. Note left of them, dead men, A Company, some of our lads. And I carried on, going down that hill. Any roads, I get halfway down, and I notice there's an old guy there. Old guy. He was younger than me, I think. We all called him old. We all called him Old Bert. His name was Albert Brown. Anyway, I looked at him, and I could tell he'd had it. I could tell straight away, but he was still alive. And he looked at me, and he said, Cliff, won't they help me, Cliff? And I said, how can I help you, Bert? He said, I ain't got no water. I said, I ain't got oat, Bert. I ain't got oat. And he said, won't they take me back? Take me back to the line? Well, I looked at him, and I can tell straight away, he weren't going to get back to the line. And I knew if I started messing about helping him, I weren't going to get back to the line. So I lied to him. I said to him, I'm going to get stretcher bearers, Bert. stay there. I'm going to get stretcher bearers. I'll be back in a minute. And I crawled past him. Any roads, he grabbed hold of my ankle, didn't he? He grabbed hold. And he said, they're not going to leave me, are you, Cliff? They're not going to leave me. Pulled my hand. I pulled my ankle out of his hand. And I carried on. And I heard him shout, don't leave me, Cliff. Don't leave me. But I had to. They knows I had to. It were me or him. Well, no, it weren't. It were him or it were both of us. I had to get back. But I tell thee, even now, 1917, I can still feel his hand on my ankle, and I can still hear his words in my head. Don't leave me. But I had to. Any roads, I got back to our front line, and I fell into our trench where we'd started that morning. And I fell into people. Frontline trench were just bits of people, all over, all bottom of it. This must have been C Company or even D Company. They never even got out at trench. They were there, littered at bottom. Any roads, I walked over people and in people. And I went down and down into support line. And I got into support trench and there were more wounded and dead there. And I didn't know what to do. And so I kept going back and back. And I got into reserve line eventually. 1,500 yards back from first line, and that's when I found someone I recognised. He was a sergeant, and I went up to him and I said, Sergeant, where are we? Where's our battalion? And he said, who are you? I said, it's me, Clifford Lone. And he said, I didn't recognise you. Anyway, he got a mug of tea in his hand, and he said to me, here, son, you need this more than me. Bloody hell, it was neat rum. But I tell thee, that's what I needed at that time. That's what I wanted. But the battle didn't end. It had to carry on. We had to break through. And I kept thinking, out there somewhere was young Jim. He was out there. I'd not seen him since we were going up that hill, so I wanted to find him.
The opening of Eckington's World War I exhibition was combined with the British Poppy Appeal launch. The Poppy Appeal launch had its most successful year for donations ever across Eckington, raising over £8,000.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's very kind. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I mean the aeroplane was a brand new invention. At the turn of the century, man could really hardly get off the ground. But of course, initially the aeroplane was used for spotting purposes, for photography and artillery range finding and so on. But then, of course, pilots started carrying guns, and eventually, of course, machine guns were fitted. The coordination between the machine gun and the propeller was perfected, and aerial warfare became quite a common feature. They also developed larger aircraft, and of course bombers appeared, particularly over London. It's rather interesting that at that particular time our royal family's family name was Saxe Coburn Gotha, and it was Gotha bombers that were bombing London. Hence, of course, the need to change the name, and we now have a royal family called Windsor. Shipping, we had the largest navy in the world at that time, and they did actually rule the waves, although of course they met opposition that they hadn't previously experienced, submarines and so on. Probably the greatest advances were in medicine, and it's always at time of conflict that these sort of things develop, and new methods of treating wounds and patching people up to sometimes probably just disguise the injury, but certainly there was a lot of advancement in the medical field. It's science at war, as I often refer to it, and of course it had some nasty side effects as well, and principally the use of gas. And there was a lot of research went into more and more ways of using those sort of substances to kill, and more ways of trying to protect yourself from being killed. Germany had a very large standing army at that particular time. Our army was very, very much smaller. We were very fortunate in that we were able to call on the Commonwealth, and a lot of troops from Australia, New Zealand, Canada came over and assisted. A lot from some of the smaller nations, and of course, after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which actually lost a lot of American lives, by 1917 the Americans had also joined the war. And although they'd acted previously as, if you like, the arsenal for the war, now they were actually providing not only just equipment but also troops, and in their thousands. And when the Americans arrived, that certainly made an enormous difference to the Allied army's strengths. The Russians, of course, had a very large army, and they were fighting on our side, as indeed, interestingly enough, were the Japanese in the First World War. The Lusitania was a cruise ship, actually a Cunarder, and she was a passenger liner. The Germans had posted an advertisement in the newspapers in America saying that vessels such as that could be liable if it was considered that they were carrying contraband equipment, for example, munitions and so on. The Lusitania was carrying a very large number of Americans, and she was torpedoed by a submarine off the Irish coast. She sank with an enormous loss of life. It was subsequently used for black propaganda purposes. It was used for recruitment purposes. The Germans actually issued a medallion which shows the ship sinking on the one side and death-selling tickets at the Cunard office on the reverse. We then replicated that and sold it as, again, black propaganda. It was certainly instrumental in bringing the Americans, who'd been very much reluctant to join the war, into the First World War. And as I say, it was used even as a battle cry. Remember the Lusitania.
Any roads. Then they moved us up here to this place, Arras. And here we are in a new trench. But things are different, I sees. Everything's altered. Firstly, 1917, we've got these new gas masks, a small box respirator. And we've all been retrained. No longer are we all riflemen. We've all got new tasks, different plans, different jobs. Some of us are what's called a rifle bomber. Now they get the Mills bombs on the end of the rifle and it can fire it 250, 300 yards. Other men, they've got the portable machine gun, the Lewis gun. Now it's so portable, I struggle picking it up. But their job, along with the rifle bombers, their job's to keep Jerry's heads down, to let the bayonet men and the bombers get into the Jerry trench. Now the bombers, they've just got the Mills bombs and they throw them around. And the riflemen, well, I can imagine what the riflemen do with the bayonet when they get into the trench. So we've all got new jobs, new training. We've got new weapons as well. Now, hang on. I saw one last year and it scared the death out of me. This massive, great big lump of metal, slowly moving, bristling with guns it were. Nothing could stop it. We call them tanks. Well, when they get into Jerry's line, all Jerry does is run off. We've got new artillery. We've got new aircraft. We've got new everything. And the great thing about being here at Arras is we've got everything is underground. You see, Arras has got all these caves and we've made them into hospitals, we've made them into barracks, we've made more tunnels going underneath. And when we attack tomorrow, some of them are going to pop up right by German line. When we attack, it's all going to be a success. New training, new weapons, new everything, even got new men.
They say that the victors always write the history. Well, we apparently won. We wrote the history. As far as we're concerned, we did win the First World War. But that was always disputed by Germany. The troops certainly felt that their government had let them down, that they'd capitulated at a time when quite honestly, it probably was going to be difficult for them to continue. They were running out of finances, out of munitions, out of men and so on. But their government capitulated. We regarded it as a victory. At the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, very, very strong reparations were ordered against Germany. They went through a terrible period during the Weimar Republic, which followed the Second World War after the Kaiser had abdicated and gone off to Holland. And as a result of that, they suffered roaring inflation. I mean, postage stamps could be overprinted to 1 million marks. And probably there was postage due by the time the letter got delivered. This, of course, is always attributed to the rise of Nazism. Hitler played very much on this. They were forbidden from having an air force, so they developed high-speed post-packet aeroplanes and so on, which subsequently became fighters and bombers and so on. They couldn't have tanks, they couldn't have a large standing army and so on. This all made them feel as if they'd been hard done by, and they never regarded the fact that they'd lost the war, and it led, ultimately, we are led to believe, to the Second World War. Probably one outcome that is often overlooked is the Votes for Women issue. During the war, women's emancipation took great leaps and bounds forward. The suffragettes, as we know, had been very active before the war, and they consciously held a rally on the embankment to say, right, we've got to get behind the government, we've got to get behind the country, we've got to support the war effort. And as a result of the efforts that they put in, working in the factories, risking their lives, I mean, some nurses went abroad and served in frontline hospitals and so on. They were initially, in a limited way, awarded the vote, and then of course eventually they all were awarded the vote. So that's probably one of the good things that may have come out of World War I.
I tell you something, I still wonder where old Jim ended up. Never did find him on the Somme. He never did turn up. I don't know what I'll tell his young man. But anyways, what's that? Time to go. Hang on, I'll finish this first. Right, time to go. A new attack. But this time, it's going to be a success. This time, we're going to break the Jerry line. I'll see you later.
Let us remember before God and commend to his sure keeping those who have died for their country in war, those whom we knew and whose memory we treasure, and all who have lived in the service of mankind. O God, the Father of all people, we thank you for our creation and preservation through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Saviour, the Prince of Peace. We pray that the whole world may be subject to his most gentle and peace-filled rule. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Ready, stand at ease.